All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody, to Asquith Hall and to this particular forum with our distinguished speaker today, who we're thrilled to have with us. I want to welcome all the outside members of the Harvard Graduate School of Education community who are joining the teams from our 6 cities and the state of Illinois who are here to work with us as part of the By All Means initiative, which is part of the ongoing work of the Education Redesign Lab. I have a simple function today at this session, which is to introduce the introducer, and I wanted to do that just because I tried to point out through the morning the people that we need to acknowledge for making possible the kind of collaboration and support that is represented in the work of the Education Redesign Lab. No one has been more central to that than the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Jim Ryan, who from the beginning, when this was just an idea, has made repeated leaps of faith in backing us up in doing this work, supporting the work, legitimizing the work within the academic community, and encouraging those of us who are on the front lines of doing it to make possible the kind of fruition that we witnessed in the presentations that we've seen this morning and in all the work that's represented by you folks being here and working with us today. So I just want to, by way of welcoming Jim to the stage, to say a rich, warm, deeply authentic thank you to him for his leadership and his support of this work. Jim Ryan.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you again. As Paul said, I'm Jim Ryan, and I'm the dean here. I am just going to say a few words by way of very brief introduction and some words of thanks, and then I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Mcafee. So, as you know, the original idea behind the Education Redesign Lab was that in order to reduce inequities in student opportunity and outcomes, we need to redesign, align, and integrate our systems of child development and education. As Paul Rebel has said so eloquently, if we personalize supports, services, and opportunities starting in early childhood, if we tailor instruction to meet each child's needs, if we braid health and social services with schools and provide access for all to high-quality expanded learning and enrichment opportunities, then we will ensure that all children, with an emphasis here on all, will have a much better chance of success. The By All Means project, which is a part of this larger effort, is designed to carry out the original idea of the Ed Redesign Lab by working directly with all of you, committed and entrepreneurial cities, to achieve systemic, integrated improvements in services for children. I remain as convinced as ever about the wisdom behind the Ed Redesign Lab and by the All Means project. I'm also aware, as I know all of you are, that this is hard work and that it requires sustained effort, attention, and coordination. And I'm grateful to all of you for continuing to engage in this work. Ideas are one thing, action is another. And in my time here as dean, I've come to believe that progress certainly requires good ideas, but in some ways that's the easy part. The truly hard part is implementation. That's why it's so exciting to see the mayors, superintendents, and city leaders from Oakland, Louisville, Providence, Salem, Newton, and Somerville here together to work on these common goals and translate ideas into action. It's been a pleasure to follow your progress and to see some of you in the news, including stories about Mayor Elorza and the Providence Education Moonshot Summit held last month, where a remarkable 450 parents, educators, and students shared input on how to make a citywide commitment to ensuring that all Providence students are successful. I also read about Mayor Driscoll's efforts to provide for and track individual students' needs through the City Connects program. I know that these are just 2 examples of the critically important and what I hope will be ultimately transformative work that's taking place in each of your cities. I'm also delighted to see that issues of race and equity have been woven into the theme of this particular convening. This is a topic that has been front and center in the HGS community as we've been discussing it for the last couple of years, last 3 years really, and continue to do so through expert lectures, small group discussions among faculty and students, and new courses and seminars devoted to the topic of racial equity and diversity. Some of you will get a chance to hear more about this work through Dominic Rollins, our Senior Officer for Diversity and Inclusion, and I know you're going to enjoy tomorrow hearing from Roberto Gonzalez on the topic of how to support immigrant and undocumented students. And I know that Dr. McAfee will have a good deal more to say about this topic as well. Before I introduce Dr. McAfee and turn over the podium, I want to give special thanks to those who have generously supported the By All Means project and made this possible, including Fritz Hobbs, Linda Hama-Ori, the Morgridge Family Foundation, Nick Donahue of the Nellie Mae Foundation, and Jody Cornish of New Prophet. I also want to thank the outstanding faculty and staff who have made this project and this convening possible, including Paul Ravel, Bridget Rodriguez, Lynn Sachs, Jennifer Davis, Jessica Boyle, and Daniel Scarver. I know they've put their heart and soul into this work, and they've done an absolutely terrific job making these convenings successful and productive, and I believe they deserve a round of applause. Now, I know you're as anxious to hear from Dr. McAfee as I am, so let me get right to introducing him. Dr. McAfee is the president of PolicyLink, which is a national research and action institute that works to advance economic and social equity. He leads executive and program teams in strategic planning, policy development, capacity building, and programmatic design and implementation at the local, state, and national levels. He joined PolicyLink in 2011, where he served as the inaugural director of the Promise Neighborhoods Institute. This work helped make PolicyLink a national leader in building cradle-to-career systems that serve youth in some of our country's most traditionally underserved areas. Promise Neighborhoods, as many of you know, are modeled after the Harlem Children's Zone, which was started by Jeffrey Canada, who I can't resist noting, even though I'm having difficulty noting, I can't resist noting that he is an alum of the Ed School. Before joining PolicyLink, Dr. McAfee served in the Chicago Regional Office of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he managed a $450 million portfolio on housing, community, and economic development. He successfully partnered with local leaders to create affordable housing, jobs, and access to social services for thousands of families. He also served as a lead instructor with HUD's Leadership Development Program, where he oversaw the training of senior executives and provided fundraising, leadership, management, and organizational development assistance to thousands of people and organizations across the city. Dr. McAfee is an Annie E. Casey Foundation Children and Family Fellow, an Aspen Institute Ideas Scholar, and a Leap of Reason Ambassador. I'm delighted he's here with us today to share his expertise in strengthening partnerships, developing strategy, and building capacity, all while maintaining a laser-like focus on equity. In other words, the most important and challenging parts of the work you are all doing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Mcafee.
Good morning. I'm going to skip some of these slides because I want to talk to you about a couple of things this morning. I'm really excited to be here because I think this is the most important work in the country. Creating communities of opportunity, it's the work for this time. And what I'm hoping you will allow me to do while we're together is to spend some of this time helping you join me in thinking about what's the work, what's needed, and how do we do what I think are three things that are necessary. How do we accelerate? How do we scale? And how do we sustain results? It's the only thing we should be in business to do. So everything that I'm going to talk to you about is really about my personal journey to do that. I don't believe in talking about theory, so I'm only going to tell you the things that I'm struggling through and what I'm learning from struggling, having successes, and having failures. I'm not asking you to agree with me. You probably won't, and I'm sharing that because sometimes my style can be one where you can project into me your own anxiety by what you hear me say. I'm not going to own your anxiety. And so what I want you to think about is, why are you triggered by some of the things that I say? I want you to really think about that for a moment. What is it about it? Are you afraid? Is it uncomfortable? Because the reality is that's all the adaptive stuff that we deal with every day. So I just wanted to start that way so you don't shut down. I might sound absolute in my opinion, but I'm not. I'm still learning with you. And so I wanted to be clear about that. And so I want to start by helping you think about Promised Neighborhoods and what that is. To me, Promised Neighborhoods is simply a federal program. It's another funding stream. It comes out of the hard work of leaders in the sectors for more than 40 years saying we need large money, big money, we need it over a sustained period of time, and we need it to be flexible for us to craft strategy on the ground. Well, we got that. Promised Neighborhoods provides up to $30 million over 5 years for folks to begin to build cradle-to-career systems. Congress has budgeted about $73 million. It is not enough. As you know, folks who have applied, you missed 2 points and you probably are out of contention. That's how competitive it is. But what I'm most excited about is that people all across the country who didn't even get the grant, in many cases sometimes do better than the folks who get the grant early on. Because they weren't focused on the grant opportunity. They were already committed to what is the moment for us in this community to do something for our children and families. And when you start there, you can accelerate. So we got Promised Neighborhoods instituted. Came with a strong results framework. 10 results, 15 indicators, spread out on that cradle-to-career continuum. Nothing special about them. Children entering school ready to learn. They're proficient in core academic subjects. Parents are talking to their kids about going to college. They have access to 21st century learning tools. None of that stuff is special. That's why I say Promised Neighborhoods is not special. What is special is what are we learning about doing what I think is necessary right now. The thing that I think is necessary right now is, are we building cradle-to-career systems in our communities? That pathway out of poverty that we talk about, is it real? Or is it just words? And when I say real, could you today come up on this stage and draw that pathway? Because if you can't, the system is fundamentally flawed. And here's why. It's flawed because we're never holding the same kids. It's flawed because we're using all the right language and the wrong practice to get to where we want to go. We look at population level data, and then we operate as if we're running a small program still. Does that make sense? And it's not like one is bad and one is good. But what I'm always trying to be clear about is, what's the difference between doing charity and doing the transformative work that I'm describing? I think we should celebrate charity, and if that's all we want to do, and if that's what we got the commitment for, we should own it. But we should stop having a heart for charity and using transformation language, because that's what's destroying the public will in our communities. You look at a population level number, get all excited, you bring everybody together to say, oh, kids are struggling, there's this inequity. And then you go design such a feckless program. Really? That's what we keep doing. Now, I know you all in this room aren't doing it, but I know you've participated in that. You've seen it happen in your places. I've watched it happen all across the country. People start off with really good intentions looking at data, and then they start walking away from that moment of revelation and start designing something that's quite mediocre. So I want to talk to you about what we're learning about how not to do that. The first thing we're learning, you see some things here that I would say as you think about accelerating, you should think about not doing. The first is projecting fantasy into something. Your fantasy about what you hope it will be, it's only going to be what you lead on it to be. And this is an important point, because so often, folks, the mayors will start something and everybody projects into the mayors like they can do this by themselves. They need all of us to help them, to support them, especially when it comes time to making some of these tough systems changes. People will project into a new superintendent, that this superintendent will be the savior. Folks will project into the nonprofit leaders that somehow nonprofit leaders can get 50% gains year over year. That's crazy. So we can't do that. So one of the things I want you to think about is, on all of those things up there, how do you show up? And I use a frame called the person, role, and system frame. The person, role, and system frame really gives me a way of walking into a space and really being conscious about why I'm there. In my person, do I actually know what I want to show up and do? Sometimes people will talk to me about equity and they act like it's a separate thing. To me, when I walk into a room, I am into doing equity work. I don't know what this work is if it isn't equity work. That's the work. The moment we're talking about inequalities, we're in an equity conversation, folks. Whether we're talking about white kids, Asian kids, black kids, it doesn't matter. So equity is not this thing that's separate from doing the work. I'm showing up with that equity consciousness. That's how I show up. I'm also showing up to get results at scale and to do it quickly. And the reason why it's important for me to know how I'm showing up is to know what I'm going to get involved in. The young Michael used to always get into conflict because I would join places that weren't aligned with what I wanted to do. And that was my fault. I was joining with groups that didn't want to accelerate, that didn't want to get scale, and I wasn't testing for commitment. It ultimately led for me getting fired in Kansas City. It was the best thing that happened, but it was a hard lesson to learn. I want you to think about in your person, how are you showing up? So what that means for me now is I actually don't participate in stuff that isn't aligned with what I'm trying to do. It doesn't mean I won't give advice and I won't even go to a meeting or two, but beyond that, I'm going to be done because what I know is I will become a distraction to that group. It's nothing wrong with where a group is at. We all have to know our contribution. I know I'm clear about what mine is. I don't make apologies for it. And so there's going to be some places where I'm just not going to participate. And I want you to think about how do you show up in your person. The second is how do you show up in your role. Many of us conceive our role so small. I always say that my job title is just an HR function. That's all it is. I show up with gifts that the Creator gave me that are bigger than a job title. I'm always going to act bigger than a job title. That's why I say I also have to work somewhere where people love me. And I'm very clear about that. I don't let people interview me anymore, folks, because I'm trying to decide if this works for me. Because I got gifts that got to get out. And many of you all know, you get into the wrong place and you try to let those gifts out, you end up getting bounced or marginalized and you die in a cubicle. I'm not going to die in a cubicle, so that means I've got to be very intentional about where I join. But what that also means is even when I showed up at PolicyLink, I didn't show up there afraid of Angela Glover Blackwell, who has a big reputation. I didn't show up there intimidated by PolicyLink, even though I was, because there's a lot of smart people. I showed up there to do the work that I wanted to do. And so I didn't worry about people saying, well, you know, Michael, we don't necessarily do it that way. You know, you're trying to bring in this data and stuff. And the good thing is we talk about race at PolicyLink, so that was the easy part. You can't work there if you can't do that. Scale is policy work, so those things were easy. But trying to bring a greater discipline to the work, trying to bring data systems into the organization, that was foreign stuff. But what I knew is that if I didn't do it, Promised Neighborhoods didn't have a chance of being successful and becoming permanently authorized. So I showed up in my role, imagining a big role for myself. And here's what I mean by that. As an intermediary, you can run an intermediary shop and you can just write, you can just show up and talk, you can just convene folks, and you can just do webinars. And people will think that's good stuff. It actually doesn't necessarily have anything to do with getting any results on the ground. Do you see how it has to be connected to something bigger? I consider that to be work avoidance if it's not grounded in a results frame. And people will give you great scores and tell you your webinars were the best that they've ever participated in, and this was the best convening and all that, but it's not changing anything, folks. So that means we've got to figure out what our value is beyond participating in tasks that are at best work avoidance. So for us, what that meant is that we needed to figure out what our value would be. And that's where the acceleration, scale, and sustain came from. Because if we can't accelerate, scale, and sustain the work, there is really no reason for us to be taking money at an intermediary level away from direct service. And I'm truly serious about that. If you're not going to add value as an intermediary, get out of the business. Because you're sucking money out of the environment that could go somewhere else. So what I want you to think about is, person, role, do you have a really big role? How you're going to take it up? Your vision is powerful. It is bigger than your job title. It's going to allow you to attract people to you so you can join in doing transformative work. And then can you imagine the system that you're in? Can you see that system? Can you feel that system? And then do you see the leverage points in it where you can actually move it, make something different happen? So I use that person, role, and system all the time. These are some of the guiding questions that I use when I'm trying to join. What's my population? Folks, I can't tell you how many communities I go in, they're telling me they're doing an exciting initiative, and then I ask them, so how many kids are you trying to serve? And they can't tell me. How can you be doing something for years and you don't even know the number? Because if you don't know the number, you're starting structurally flawed in the first place. Then when I ask people, what are they building? they'll start telling me a bunch of programs. Holding a bunch of programs is not actually building a system. I use the supply chain literature because I can't find an analog in our sector. But when I talk about cradle to career, I'm talking about a supply chain. The only difference is we're trying to create opportunity for children who don't have it. That's the product. But a supply chain needs to be fully articulated. And in many cases, this is why we struggle with sustainability. We're actually not talking about redesigning the system. We're talking about slapping together a hodgepodge of programs and praying that they actually work differently this time. That ain't gonna work. You've got to actually redesign the ecosystems that you're working in if you want to get bigger and better results, folks. And that means that we're not trying to maintain a nonprofit ecosystem. We're trying to figure out what's the best design of our institutions to serve children. It's a very different conversation than saying, and you often see this happen with CDBG money, formula dollars at HUD. And instead of thinking about how to use those dollars to design stuff in the way that it needs to be designed, it often devolves into a grant-making program where you invite 300 folks into a room and you'll just start divvying the money up. And before you know it, you've given everybody something, but you've starved them all. And they don't even have enough money to do really superior work. They can do charity work, but that's it. So what I want you to think about is if you were to talk about pathways out of poverty, cradle to career systems, what would that system that you draw look like in your place? And who can deliver on it today and deserves to be capitalized? Not everybody. And how will you then begin to redesign all the funding that is flowing from the city, county, and state into our communities to do this work? And or how will you go out and begin to create new tax revenue for it? So let's be clear. This isn't going to be sustained magically. You're going to have to make some tough decisions about things that you want to do, and that's where the rubber meets the road. And so that's why I'm asking these questions early on, because we're trying to get people's head around what are they actually really ready to do. And there's nothing wrong with not being ready to do this work yet. Nothing wrong with that. You start where you can, and we start building the muscle to get there. Cradle to career work, no one builds the cradle to career infrastructure all at once. People take a place of it. They may start with scholarships. They may start with early learning. Doesn't matter where you start. You do that really excellently, and you hold that vision of continually building onto it as you develop that muscle. One of the things I've been most surprised for is to watch the city of Oakland, quite frankly, who have blown by a lot of folks who were doing Promised Neighborhoods work, simply because of the work of my colleague in the room, David Silver, and the mayor. They had a powerful vision that accelerated over where a lot of people started. Now they can go back and build this other infrastructure. But what they did was catalyze a community to think really big, to start shaking trees and getting people to want to invest differently. Now they've got people's attention. Now they can go back and do all that operational stuff. So it doesn't matter where you start. The question is, are you holding something that is transformative that you can build upon? So here's the system that I hold in my head that we implemented in Promised Neighborhoods, because here's where I think we really struggle. If you think about all the schools that people come out of, folks aren't getting really good systems work, practice. They're not getting really good operations practice. They don't get that in schools. You look at social work, schools of education, public policy, public administration, they don't get that. So you're talking about systems work and you're telling people to do it, but they actually don't have a mental map for it in their head. And so the first thing that I discovered was my own bad practice was that I'm asking people in 60 communities across the country to do something for which they actually don't have a mental map for. So they would shake their head and say, yeah, yeah, yeah. They would parrot all the right language back. But then when I say demonstrate the skill, they couldn't do it. I'm sure you all see that as well, right? You see people who can parrot all the right language, but actually can't demonstrate proficiency in the skill that's necessary. That was my bad practice. Imagine a coach that can't articulate the offense and defense that they want someone to get into. Well, that's part of the problem in our work. We call a meeting for 100 folks, we need 12 of them. Bad practice. There is no real discipline guiding our work, just good intention, folks. And if the sector is going to get better, whether you're using results-based accountability like we use or Six Sigma, et cetera, you need to be using an evidence-based approach for creating what we call the container to get results. What is the space that you're creating that will accelerate results, that you can get people into a system, you can build on their talents, and you can drive them to execute? And that's bigger than just saying, I slapped an agenda together and I called a meeting of folks so we can talk about a problem for the 20th time in our community. And so this is the system that we ultimately created. And it starts very simply. It doesn't matter where you start in this. It's not a linear process. The question is, can you get people in this system? Where we see people break down is actually they haven't made collective sense-making of the journey they want to be on in the first place. So all this stuff around population results, indicators, and strategy, if we just stop there, people will often look at indicators. That's how they start. They looked at an indicator, it was really bad, and they said, oh my God, let's get people together. It's a really bad indicator. But then they don't back up and say, well, how many kids or families do we want to help? So that's why they start structurally off. If you can't talk about the population and the results you want to declare and the indicators, it's really hard to craft good strategy, folks. How do you know what you should do? And you need to get some consensus around that before you jump into strategy. And often when you try to have a conversation like this, people want to jump all the way down the programs and just start saying, well, this is what we should do. And I should give you a host of good examples of why that's really bad practice. In promised neighborhoods, there's one indicator around children, parents talking to the kids about going to college. In one community, the nonprofit is really good. It has deep roots there, a lot of community ownership. They did a community survey. 90+% of the parents were talking to their kids about going to college. But it was a frontline worker who knew the community really well who said that number seems really high. So they went back out and did what they should have done if you're really following good, rigorous processes for how you triangulate data and make sure that what you're looking at makes sense. They went back out and started asking more questions and found out that 90+% of their kids, parents were talking to their kids about college. They were telling them not to go. And so this is a perfect example where you jump over wanting to go through disciplined strategy setting to start doing stuff, only to try to walk back 2 or 3 years later because you're embarrassed. And that's what happens over and over in our spaces because we don't bring discipline. What we say is you got to be able to understand the nature and the logic of the indicator. Why is it trending in a particular direction? And then how do we marry what the evidence says about what would get it going in the right direction with our professional judgment to come up with some hypotheses about what would work? And all we're trying to do here is craft emergent strategy. This is why I think grant-making proposals are just bull, because they're fiction. Because if you're going to craft emergent strategy, that means we got to learn. And so many of our proposals take learning away because you wrote something before you got a grant, conditions on the ground change, and now you're wedded to something that is irrelevant. And what you really need to be able to do is to say, look, the nature and the logic of the indicator is dynamic. My ability to learn and craft strategy from what I'm getting from the environment needs to be dynamic as well. And I can still hold myself accountable because we're going to be telling a story of moving from the baseline or not. Does that make sense? And then we can move down to what I think is the most important part, which is how do we put the right mix of solutions together to get to scale? How do we put the right mix of solutions together? Not just one, usually programs. How do we put the right mix together? And the most important thing here is that I think that families need to own a contribution before anyone else. I don't believe in community engagement. I think that's a smokescreen for folks who just don't want to roll up their sleeves and know how to talk to folks. I often tell people I never had to take a class to learn how to talk to white people. I didn't. You know, no one ever had to say to me, Michael, take a class so you can feel comfortable with those folks. I'm always fascinated by people who have to say they got to take classes. I don't understand how to connect. I don't know where to find them. You're probably not the right person for the job. Seriously, folks. This becomes barriers all the time. It's like folks who just simply have different resource challenges. Somehow they're like these exotic folks that are hard to communicate with. We can't understand them. You can't understand them because you're not a part of them or you're afraid of them or whatever it might be. But that's your own challenge. It shouldn't get in the way of the work. So I don't talk about engagement because I think engagement is irrelevant. It's not results-based. Ownership is. The price of admission to our container, our space where we do work, is that everybody has to own a contribution. You don't come into this room if you don't own a contribution. Because if you come in this room and you don't own a contribution, I got to manage your personality. And I'm sure you've seen this happen all the time. Folks come to the room, we haven't actually done our work to give them a way to join. So they start getting us off on craziness, right? They get us off on their personality. They start prosecuting things that were going on 20 years ago in the community. They start prosecuting grievances between nonprofits. They start telling us we should talk to more consultants, right? All work avoidance behaviors. And the real problem is simply I haven't created the right conditions to extract their contribution. So that's why the price of admission needs to be, before you come into this room, I need to have worked with you to get your contribution. So when you come in here, you're locked and loaded on helping me understand what you're failing at so that I can get you to work. Does that make sense? Let me slow down and say it again, because some of you look like, I don't know. What I'm saying is this. We often start by pulling people together who actually have no way of making a contribution to a result. If it's third grade reading, why do I start by having housing folks, third grade reading folks, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of folks in the room? I'll call a meeting with all those folks when I really want to focus on third grade reading. Why don't I find the folks who are dealing with third grade reading first, figure out how we're going to accelerate, instead of having housing folks in the room who are saying, I don't understand how I have a contribution. Entrepreneurs, I don't know. There may be eventually, right? We know that housing and reading and all that stuff has a connection. But we call meetings in an unstructured way so folks don't actually know how to join, because we're not clear on our sense making in the first place. You see my point? So when they come into the room, it's loosely developed. They don't know what to do. So they start acting out. They're frustrated that the meeting is wasting their time, et cetera. So they'll start throwing out whatever they can, whatever their strength is. If your strength is community organizing, you start talking about community organizing. If your strength is housing development, you might want to get us going over there. If you heard a sexy TED Talk, you might want to tell us, hey, we all need to go listen to that TED Talk. When the reality is that has nothing to do with third grade reading and what we need to structure. Does that make sense? So what I need people to come into the room with is a contribution. And I need to start with families, because too often we let families come in the room and they've given away their agency. They sit there and we're talking about their data, their kids, as if they're not in the room. And they have a major role to play. Some of the most simple and elegant examples of this is folks couldn't figure out what to do. Folks in San Antonio started saying, you know what, they gave families calendars. They said, just put a sticker on the calendar the day you read to your kid. And if the kid is able to, let them scribble something that they liked about what you read to them, or you tell us an insight that came from it. When they had the community meetings, the families started bringing their calendars. It's a contribution. Then they started talking to their families about, do you have a space in the house that is about for learning, that's set up for learning? So then they started bringing pictures of the learning space, something that sounds so simple, most homes don't have them. Then they were able to start talking about Dr. Jack Shankoff's work around toxic stress, how to make the house less stressful for kids so that they can learn. You see how you use the simple calendar as a wedge in? Now there's 3 ways families can come into this room owning something now. Community engagement simply means they came to a meeting and let me talk at them. Community ownership means, oh, no. We're not going to talk about third grade reading and you sit there acting like you don't have anything to do with your kids. That's crazy. So they come to the room now helping us understand what they need help with. Now, instead of us organizing around them, nonprofits organize around the families. What are you struggling with? What do you need help with? That's very different than me saying, hey, I got a program, let me cram it down your throat. You see the difference? The user experience is different because we're in service of the families, which is what you and I ask for all the time. It's not unique. We don't take things that people just give us. We want it to be curated for our unique needs, right? So that's what I mean about all of those. Then we can figure out, of the nonprofits, which ones are really doing really good work, which ones can measure success, et cetera, around third grade reading, and what is their contribution. Some might say, you know what, I appreciate this new effort, but I don't want to play right now. No problem. I'd rather know that now than have them sitting in a room being a distraction, because they really are committed. And it may be for very good reasons. Maybe they don't have the funding, whatever it could be, but we want them to be committed. And then we can't talk about scale and equity without talking about systems and policy work, folks. We can't talk about systems and equity and scale without talking about systems work. And here's why. In some cases, systems work is really low-cost stuff and powerful. Sometimes systems work is low-cost stuff and really powerful. Sometimes it's expensive. But imagine if we've seen in Minneapolis where the superintendent said, we're not going to kick black and brown kids out of school anymore. The buck stops with me. I want to review all disciplinary actions before a decision is made. It's a powerful systems change. Didn't take a lot of money. Didn't take 5 years of research. It took a leader owning their role differently. Does that make sense? And if we think about in our communities, all around our communities, you and I are able to make decisions in our organizations if we choose to. And we got to stop hiding behind the fallacy that we can't. Do your job. Do your job. And so systems improvements can be expensive, and as a leader, you make decisions about what you're going to do and not do every day. Make them in service of the results you say you want to be in service of. That's all I'm saying. And then it's hard to get to scale, folks, if you're not going to talk about policy. People are not going to program their way into this stuff. There's not enough money, the way it's currently structured, to create all the programs that we want for folks. The white middle class wasn't built off of really good programs, policy programs, FHA, GI Bill. And so we know how to create communities of opportunity that can lift hundreds of thousands up. When it comes to kids of color, though, we act like we forgot how to do that. But we know how to create policies that actually work for large numbers of folks. And so what I want you to think about is, how do you hold the right mix of solutions so that folks can do their work? And what you're able then to do is start telling folks, you know what, hey, if I work with families, I can get you to X number. If we weave in the nonprofits, we can get to X number. If we do the systems and policy work, we can really do this. Does that make sense? That's the scale conversation. That's the scale conversation. We could be talking about a neighborhood, and we could be focused on working in a neighborhood. And we could take what we're learning from that neighborhood, translate that into systems and policy work, and now we're helping kids all across the state, or all across the city or a region. And so I needed to slow down and put this system in place in order for me to express my point of view about acceleration, scale, and sustainability. And once you have this in place, then you can begin to start redesigning your system and telling people they need to fund it this way. And that's what we're starting to see happen now. So instead of nonprofits being picked off fighting for grants individually, they're starting to put master proposals together and saying, look, this is what we're building. Early learning providers are saying, this is what the early learning system looks like in the North Side Achievement Zone in Minneapolis. You know what? It costs us X amount of dollars. Don't fund any of us individually. Fund our master proposal. And in there, you see their line item in the budget. So everybody knows what they're getting on the front end. They know what their contribution is and their targets are. It's a very different way of conceptualizing, right? They're actually designing a system, and then they're saying to funders, you know what, if my capital isn't structured right, let's not have this conversation. And this is an important point, to not decouple capital and data from leadership. I can't lead on this if the capital isn't structured right. I can't lead on this if folks aren't committed from moving from talk to action. We can look at data all day long. The leadership function has to be married to how we're going to structure the capital, how we're going to use data for learning, continuous improvement, and shared accountability. That's what we got to do. And then nonprofit leaders can exercise their right in the ecosystem, which is to say, we know best how to do this work because we're in relationship with folks on the ground. I actually don't need you to create new initiatives. What I need you to do is to be thoughtful about how you structure the capital and release it to us so that we can do what we know how to do. You see my point? Very different relationship. Very different relationship. We don't need other initiatives, folks. We need folks who can scale what we know works already. We need to transform our institutions to be prepared to do this work, because they're not right now. And what I mean by that is this. It amazes me how often people will say, Michael, can you come to my city and say something and talk, and can you say these things because people don't listen to me? It's amazing how folks don't listen to the geniuses in their own community. In a structure like this, folks, the wisdom is already in the room. That's why I extracted the contribution from you before you came in the room. The wisdom is already in the room. Having people outside of the room come in and talk to you and get you excited is performance. I can come in a community and perform. People get all titillated about equity and all that, and then I leave, and they're still talking about it 2 years later because they're afraid to do it. You see my point? I'll give you a good example. And my boss and I, we were getting ready to invite it to a keynote, and we just started getting frustrated that every time we would go places, it would just be all white folks in the room. And it would be about an equity conversation. So we just started getting really polite. I would try to be really mean about it. But Angela's so graceful. So Angela would just start asking questions. So can you tell me, what's the makeup of the audience going to be, et cetera? And so people start talking. You start hearing the stuttering on the phone, et cetera. And so it got to a place that was a big united way. And we decided, we said, you know what, we thank you for asking us to come, we're just not going to come. And then she said, now, Michael, you go tell them why we're not coming. So I told him, I said, we would love to come, but then this is really disheartening that we're getting ready to have a conversation, but we really won't have a quality conversation because, one, community is not there and it's not diverse. So we're sorry, and it's no judgment against you. If you don't want to do that, that's okay. But they came back, transformed the audience. Somehow they magically figured out how to do community engagement overnight. Powerful conversation. When we got there, it was one of the most powerful experiences that I've had with folks actually moving to do the work. But that is an example of us taking our role up again and saying, you know what, no, I'm not going to keep participating with grown folks who act like they can't do their job. They don't know how to create a diverse meeting. How can you know folks in a community for 20 plus years and you can't call a diverse table? How can that happen, folks? You're going to hold a conference and you can't have a diverse panel. But you've been in a community for 20 plus years and you don't know anyone, you should be fired. And in any other sector, if you couldn't deliver, you would be. You would be. And so when we're talking about equity and all these things, the question is not about how it's going to happen and change takes time. That's all bull. The question is, are you ready to step up and do it? At this stage of my career, if I can't convene a meeting that has diverse voices, whether I agree with them or not, that's problematic. That is not a skill deficiency. That is a will deficiency. I know how to do it. The question is, will I do it? And am I in a culture that will compel me to do it even if I don't want to do it? And in too many cases, your cultures are soft. Your cultures are not up. They don't have the grit necessary to do this work. They don't have the grit necessary to do this work. Because this work requires that you have an edge. Folks, I walk around angry all the time. I walk around angry all the time because I come out of poverty. My two sisters still live in poverty. Every day, if I want to get an update on poverty, all I got to do when I talk to my mama, I get an update on poverty. Every day. And so I carry that contempt for folks, including myself, who get out, have an opportunity to make a difference, and then they get these jobs and they're so satisfied just to talk. What a disgrace. Imagine me spending my whole life trying to get out of poverty. I'm finally there now, out of it, and now I don't have anything to say. But I want to be mad at white folks and structural racism and all that, right? When I'm actually maintaining the structure, the very structure that I could rail against and try to beat white folks up and down the head about. But when my number gets called, I'm no different. And in many cases, white folks are doing more than I'm doing. Come on, people. This stuff will not change magically. I don't care what frame you use. The frame is not magical. The tools are not magical. They will only be animated by your leadership. And that's why I started with how you show up. In this moment, folks, we can transform the nation. And while folks are scared, I'm not scared of this moment because I understand something. Poor people were fine before, they're going to be fine after. And in many cases, we haven't been helping them anyway. So whether you got Trump in the office or someone else, the question still remains, can I have housing? Will I have a job? Will my neighborhood be safe? Trump is irrelevant in my world. And the population that I serve, he's irrelevant too. Doesn't mean he can't do some harm, but folks were already being harmed, folks. So don't get distracted when you weren't living up to the challenge in the first place. Don't be mad at Trump because he owned his people. I say that to folks all the time. Don't be mad at Trump. He told you who he cared about. He owned his number. He owned his population, did he not? And everywhere I go, people say, well, you know what, Michael, we talked about equity last year. Don't talk about it this year. What? Don't talk about race. We talked about that last year. Okay. That's why you have Trump. Because this sector keeps trying to exotically describe stuff in a way that after it's all said and done, folks can't even understand what you're talking about. Folks, we're talking about poverty. We're talking about structures that oppress. And you can keep trying to make that stuff as flowery as you like. It just means you're afraid to do the work because it ain't working. Folks don't understand it. Every new year, there's a new frame. Every new year, there's a new way to talk about poverty. And the question on the street still remains, are you going to help me access opportunity? That's the question. No matter how exotic you can get because of all your education and student loan debt, the question is still the same. And I want you to think about that. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm trying to be hard-hitting to say, folks, we are at a moment now where the only thing matters is doing the work. That's real. Your frameworks aren't until they get animated. Your language is not until it gets animated through you. And so stop going back, hoping the mayors are going to do it all, hoping the superintendent's going to do it all. The only question on the table is, what are you going to do? And who will you join with to do that? This work is about abandoning yourself to the strengths of others. It is about that. You got to be willing to do that. Because if you're going to hold a big number, you can't do it by yourself. That's the power of it. It will compel you to do things you don't like to do. Like, I don't like to collaborate. I don't have time for group process. It gets on my nerves. But if I want to do what I want to do, I don't have a choice. Does that make sense? Now the question is, can I join with other folks who want to fight? With other folks where we're making collective sense of our journey together? With folks who are understanding what the work is for this moment? Articulated pathways into opportunity. A dismantling of oppressive structures. And then overlaying that with all the other good stuff that goes on. Scholarships, programs, etc. That's the work for our generation. That is the work for our generation. Results at scale, creating communities of opportunity. That is the unfinished business. Jeff Canada, Angela Glover Blackwell, Paul, others, they've given us a field. Our journey now is to take it to the next phase. The next phase is hard because the easy stuff's been done. It is not creating your new project. It is not about creating your new sexy program so you can put your name on and say you were the founder of X. It is now to lead on the systems and policy work. And it is about you having the courage to go into rooms, whether it's the White House, whether it's Congress, whether it's a business boardroom, whether it's a foundation, and talk the same way I'm talking here. I need to be talking when I'm in the White House, in Congress, or somewhere else. Can you hold the interest of your population and have a consistent constitution no matter who you're talking to? Because one thing I know is this: you're going to go out of this game one way or the other. You might as well go out on your own terms. That was the beauty of getting fired in my 20s. I discovered what I care about. And if you think you are as good as you think you are, you'll be okay. If I get fired now, I can always go to Australia. I got a lot of relationships over there. You got to always have a safe house. I got a safe house. But what I'm telling you, there is something powerful about being liberated to do this work, folks, and do it authentically. And that's all people are asking us to do. Step up and do this work commensurate with your God-given gifts. If you do that, we will advance equity. We'll create a nation where everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So I'm going to stop there and open it up, and we'll take questions. So thank you. What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
First of all, it's great to have a fabulous Oaklander. I wanted to ask you to go a little deeper and maybe give us some more examples around systems and policy changes.
Sure.
I think for those of us who work in government, we came to government with great intentions. We came, with hearts for social justice. And so it is really hard for us to face up to the ugly truth that our public institutions are steeped in racism.
Gotcha.
That they are preserving systems and continuing practices that perpetuate racism and oppression. And so, and I know, like in California, it was a big deal when we eliminated willful defiance as a means for suspending a student. And so what are those other hidden opportunities for systems and policy changes to kind of reverse engineer the oppression that is built into our public systems that are run by us well-meaning people?
Great question. I'll give you a couple of really good examples. And so the first thing and if somebody can help keep me on track with time, that'll be great. the first thing I want you to think about, and I had to start asking myself this question at PolicyLink, even though we helped put equity on the map, it doesn't mean that we got equity down. I'm always asking myself, who's being left behind in our institution? And who does it not serve maximally? So like when I became president, one of the first things I asked was, where is the executive compensation versus the lowest paid person in the organization? Found out that it's only at 5%. That's really good. But I need to know those things, right? Because it's really easy to create a system of inequity just by living in our organization. That was the first thing. Then I asked, where are the Native Americans? Where do we hire? Where do we recruit for them? I don't see that voice naturally, obviously, in the organization, but I'm asking that question. Because there's something that's got to change in our system, because where we recruit, we probably won't find them. Does that make sense? So the first thing, as an institutional leader, I'm asking those questions. In government, one can ask the question, where is our systems inhospitable to a particular population? For me, when I talk about a population that we own, it's the 100 million folks living at 200% of poverty in America, 1 in 3 people. It's a whole lot of folks we can work with. And the easiest way to start asking that question is then bring the consciousness to what happens when certain policies are put in place. I'll give you a couple of examples, but one way to do that is to start having user design experience meetings, much like corporations do for us, so that you can figure that out. Imagine if you're doing financial security work in like East St. Louis. The Department of Justice Ferguson report was great on this. You're doing great financial security work, you're getting people's credit scores up, they're excited about all this, only to discover that they get a $50 ticket, it morphs into $1,500, $3,000 in a couple of months. Or paying that ticket was a difference, or them getting their car impounded was the difference between them keeping their job or losing it. That decision to finance municipalities off of the backs of poor folks, because you don't over-police for tickets in the rich neighborhoods. You see my point? That's an example of an inhospitable system that says, you know what? I can extract wealth from this population because they're not going to fight back. I get a ticket. I know the place I can call in California, pay $200, the ticket goes away. I can speed all I want because I know how to take care of it. Does that make sense? But folks who can't do that, what do? There's whole industries built up around that. You just look at traffic tickets as an example. Whole industries built up to serve folks like me, to keep me from getting points on my license. I got stopped figuring out how to take my new car, drive down from Oakland to LA, pulling out of a Burger King with my wife. No, I wasn't even hitting, I wasn't even ready to speed yet because I had just turned. Police pulls me up, starts questioning me on the type of car I have. Gave me a ticket. And I'm irrelevant. I was like, I'm not going to talk to you. I don't have nothing to say to you. Just give me the ticket. Because I didn't care, right? And I was not going to be disrespected. He gave me my ticket, but I called one of those places. I was like, screw you. You're the one that's going to have to take the time to go to court. I don't even have to show up, dude. You see my point? Pay the $200, gone. But this is a little town that is known for doing that to folks passing through. Well, in our communities, our communities are known for punishing folks who live in areas that are at a particular economic level. And so that is an example. If we took policing, I ain't even just talking about fighting violent crimes, et cetera. I'm talking about if you look at how fines and fees are levied. Fines and fees, and there's a lot of work being done around this in New Orleans and other places, where you can see that system is immensely inhospitable to folks who can least afford to have an additional fine. And so that's an example there to say, okay, well, let's spread this out if we want to do it, great, but let's spread that out. Let's do these police traps over here on this side of town. Let's do them down where I live in Jack London Square. That ain't happening where I live. That's an example. So if we can bring people together to say, hey, you know what, we don't even have to think about this hard. We don't even need to have consultants. Just ask the question. Bring folks into the room who are living at that 200% of poverty and say, how is my system hurting you? They'll tell you. The question is, do you want to do something about it? Because they'll tell you all the ways in which kids end up going to jail for truancy or whatever, and their families end up having to pay room and board. You're already poor. Kids have to pay fees. My little nephew's in jail right now. I had to pay $15,000 to keep him from doing 20 years because he was running with the wrong boys, was getting in and out of trouble. he finally was running around with 26-year-old boys, broke into a place, started stealing the keys out of the apartment complex. So he was already going to get in trouble for robbery. Started sleeping with one of the older boys' girlfriend. The boyfriend told the girlfriend, if you don't say he raped you, I'm going to beat you up and kill you. So she said he raped her. So they called me. I'm the only one. This is where you never escape poverty. I'm the only one who can pay anything to help him. So I get an attorney. They find out that this story was fabricated. Everybody's telling different things or whatever. But he's now still got to do 2.5 years. I said, can you please keep him in jail? Because the reality is if he gets out again, I'm afraid he's going to get hurt. He doesn't fear anybody, et cetera. So he's doing 2 years, then he turns 18, and now he's getting his head right. But they're trying to make him pay restitution for all this craziness. He don't even have a job. And so that's another example of an inhospitable system. It's like you're tacking on all this stuff. Me and my mother pay so he can call us and we send money to him for the commissary. They take 50% of it. I was like, really? And nowhere do they tell you that. I just find out. So imagine I'm trying to talk to my nephew regularly so that I can help him stay on track. They take 50% off the top. Inhospitable system. Now imagine families who can't afford that. Every time we send something, they're taking 50% off the top. We can't afford it. My sister can't. My nephew's father can't. And so it's all these little these systems things. Right now, these aren't big money things that we have to go and have consultants come and help us do. And we can choose not to do that. We could choose not to do that. Because in many cases, that money is subsidizing corporations and their management of the police systems. So those are examples there where if we stop doing that stuff, people's lives can be better. Ask the question. Bring people in and ask them to do the same way Apple does with you so they know, you know what, your thumb should only touch that button once or twice to be where you want to go. Ask the people who you're privileged to serve, how is this system hurting you, and watch what they say. They'll tell us. The problem is too many of us as institutional leaders don't listen. And when we do listen, we'll write a report and then not do the work. We'll write a report and then not do the work. The Ferguson report was beautiful because it was a beautiful example of how a system is designed to extract wealth from poor people. And if anyone would have read that report and just said, let me just walk around my own community and ask that question, how does that play out here? So what I want you to think about, because I know this is what you're doing in Oakland, is how do you show up with the consciousness to care about equity? By asking who's being left behind, who's being hurt. If you do that, you will discover all these exciting ways in which you may not even have to collaborate. You can just make some executive decisions. Really powerful stuff. That's getting results at scale, and we didn't have to create no brand new collaborative. We just had to figure out how to stop doing this stuff that's hurting folks when we know we wouldn't have the heart to ever do that. And this is where why I hold my anger. I can't stand people who, I don't even know a nice word to say here. I can't stand people who project a level of strength that I know of on the street they would never project it. So I come from a place where, you know what, you can act that way if you like, but when you walk out this door, it's going to get settled up. And in this space, there's too many of us in this room who project this bravado, but then are afraid to pass a city council resolution. Project bravado, and then says, but people will get mad if we talk about it. Of course they will. What did you think was going to happen? Folks, equity is a fight. What did you think it was? No matter whether we want to stay in the fake news or whatever, the system was designed to oppress people. And many of those institutions are still there. So do you thought folks were just going to give them up? I can't tell you how many people tell me to be nice. But if you fight, I don't have to be mean. Do it your way. Do it your way. And this really bothers me as an African-American man because I always have to be conscious of how I show up. Because when I started my career at a community foundation, my passion and everything was considered anger. They sent me to talk to Dr. Dottie Fanninsteel for a year. That was my first experience of being in white culture, working culture, where I had to realize that if I didn't get a handle on how people experience my energy, I wouldn't be successful. And we laughed about her daughter because she knew nothing was wrong. She was like, welcome to the real world, Michael, you got to figure this out. And that's what I mean. It's like people are always easy to project in the folks who have that passion and commitment. When I'm happy, if you can say it in a flowery way that works nice, then God bless you, say it that way. I wish I didn't have to get mad and fight. I wish someone else in the room, I say that all the time, I wish white folks would do this. I wish white folks would lead on equity. I don't talk about race and equity. I talk about this because people expect me to talk about race and equity. I don't bring up that stuff. I get into this conversation for this very reason. Because if I talk about race and equity, I'm going to probably shut more people down than I'm going to bring to the work. I'm in an equity and race conversation when I start looking at the data and disaggregating it and moving them through that. So I don't talk about race and equity. And what a shame that I got to figure out ways to finesse it when other folks can bring their whole selves to the work and don't have to do that. That's why folks are angry. Because I'm always like a genie in a bottle. I always got to keep something tamped down. And while I'm holding myself down, nobody else is stepping up. That creates an immense level of frustration, folks. And so, long story short, think about how Apple and others design stuff for you and I. They ask us, what do we need? What doesn't work, et cetera. Imagine if city leaders all across this country said, I don't want to hear from the rich folks. I'm going to go over in the hood and ask y'all, how could this work better for you? Watch what you get. Brilliance. Because they could design the whole system of how it's screwing them. They'll put it up on a board for you like that because they live it every day. And even folks of color have to be careful because I had forgotten how the system works because I ain't been around it until I started wondering why my account was so low, and I called his social worker and said, what's up with my money? That's the only reason I was reminded. So even I'm too far removed to be purist in my equity fight. The way you need to stay grounded, no matter what race you are, is to stay connected to the people. It's the only way. Otherwise, it gets too seductive to lose your way into systems thinking. If I want to know the best system right now, all I got to do is call my nephew up and tell me, how does this work? Does that make sense? It is that simple and elegant. The beauty is not in how complex we make stuff now, folks. The beauty is in how brilliantly simple we make it and how we act on it. That's all that's left. Yes, sir.
I want to ask you about the first word up there, acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. David Williams speak not too long ago, and he gave us some figures from the U.S. Census Bureau from 2014 on median wealth and race in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
For every dollar that I as a white man have of wealth, you as a black man have 6 cents.
Mm-hmm.
How long is it going to take us to turn that around? What's the acceleration that we can, how much acceleration do we have to wait for here?
So I'll give
how long can you wait?
It's a really good question. That's why I'm talking about acceleration, because if you look at, I forget who put out the new report about the racial wealth gap, said it takes 200 plus years, we were going to catch up. That's a number, but that makes people shut down because people can't even process that. The reality is, though, we need to start thinking about different solutions that are radical than programs. So I recently facilitated a panel with Tom Shapiro, who wrote Toxic Inequality. And in his book, I was reading a couple of insights that were important to me that I was struggling with. One was, if you move into, as a person of color, if you move into a community that is more than 10% people of color, probability of that house appreciating goes down. So I asked them the question, then should you be telling people of color to buy houses then? Because it's a huge cash outlay, and the appreciation won't be the same as whites. That American dream model might not be the thing that works for folks. And he didn't want to answer that question. We're still having a conversation about it. Because I was asking a street smart question. The American dream doesn't work the way you're telling me it works. So I'm asking you, why should you tell me to buy a house and put all that money down on a house that's not going to appreciate as my white counterparts if it gets over 10%, and God help you if it gets to 20%? Does that make sense? The second thing he started bringing to light for me was how the structuring of benefit packages accelerates wealth or not. And we don't think about it. So the reason why I'm sharing with you things is I've been looking around the world thinking about what next for PolicyLink. I've been thinking about, wow. So my wife, I was talking to her last night. She's applying for a new job. And she says, Michael, they give me an 85% bonus on my base salary. They put in 14% into my 401k. That's not even counting matches or anything. I was like, what? Think about the acceleration of that, the accelerating nature of the structure of that benefit package. Now, usually that ain't reserved for people of color, a lot of us. But we're privileged now. And so what we're thinking about is how do you remove the benefit package structure outside of the corporate environment and actually have them to be portable so you can weave in those accelerants? Because the system doesn't work. We've got to start thinking in those systems ways. So we're actually thinking, how do you create benefit structures that can actually replace the way the system is today? Because that's what the accelerating issue is. If Maya and I, no matter what race we are, keep getting opportunities like that, folks who are working in the service sector can never catch up. Most working class folks who are middle income would never catch up to us now. As far as that goes, that's why you see this tension between middle class and poor folks right now. So we've got to start thinking about radically different ways about how we design our society, because the ways that the way they are designed, you can't catch up. And we got to own that without some radical disruption. And I was reading somewhere that someplace said that only times inequality, when they've gotten really bad, have they been taken care of is because there was some calamity, like a plague or something. I was like, wow, that's really deep. But that's true. So what I'm saying to you all, and this is why I talk about acceleration, we've got to come to this work really radically prepared to do something very different than what we're doing. Because that's why people are becoming so angry. And here's the danger to our democracy. If folks really believe that our institutions can't deliver, what's left? If folks really believe that our institutions, government, nonprofits, communities of faith can't deliver, what are you asking them to believe in? And that's what we're dangerously close to right now. Because we're afraid to dream. We're afraid to get out of our comfort zone. Folks, when folks get mad, you won't be able to gate yourself off. Any of you all ever been to South Africa? Barbed wire up on top of these fancy houses and stuff. It ain't gonna stop anybody from coming in if they want to. Folks, we gotta figure this out. And for me, what it means, which is why you hear me talking about acceleration, scale, and sustainability, as an institutional leader of PolicyLink now, it means I gotta be doing more than writing. I gotta get big policy wins. And I gotta be framing new solutions that are scalable solutions. So that's why I'm talking about removing benefit structures from the way they currently exist. Because I can't keep playing with a structure that is just not gonna work. I've gotta radically reinvent something. And so that's what we're owning inside my own organization. That's what I'm asking you all to think about now. What would transforming the system look like with an equity consciousness? With an equity consciousness, because sometimes we blow up the system and we turn it into a private sector feeding frenzy like we did in New Orleans with education, and some would say that that ain't necessarily working. Folks are getting paid well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's resolved a lot of the issues of the previous system. Some would say it is doing better. But if we bring that equity consciousness, we'll be able to answer some of these questions. So the issue of acceleration, for me, starts with our sense-making and us getting really real about what political capital are we willing to expend to make something happen now? And how do we set folks up who are in that political world, who are vulnerable, to give them the air cover that they need to do this work? So your question is an important one. This is why this sense-making is so important. That's not stuff you can just leave to chance. You really have real pressures. You got to win elections. You got city council folks you got to get buy-in to. That's not irrelevant stuff. And we can figure out how to give the mayor air cover so that we all can play our role more assertively, more transformatively. So that's what I want you to think about. It's the question that I get, that's why I get so angry, because when I think about acceleration and I know how far people are behind and then I watch what we do, it just is no way. So this is where I'm like, we got to stop looking at a number that we have no commitment to do anything about, right? Especially if you're then going to say, don't talk about race and class, because you have to. And so to me, I'd rather have those conversations and those debates up front than to keep destroying public will by launching new stuff that can never live up to its potential. And people keep saying, you know what, we did that 5 years ago, didn't work, no need to do it now. That's the danger of what we're doing. We're feeding into this toxic narrative that our institutions can't work. And that narrative is going to keep destroying our democracy if we don't fix it. A couple more questions. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question about readiness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely something that, so something that can come up at any point in that model is you get to that sweet spot, the conversation happens, people are like, yeah, we're going to do that. And then somebody says, we're not ready. They're not ready. And then we do the other thing, the lesser thing, the thing that we did 5 years ago that we've been doing. So can you talk a little bit about this barrier of this word readiness and how we overcome that?
I believe you overcome it by helping people understand that they are not safe. I don't understand how you can be a professional in a sector and not be ready. I don't know anywhere, place where you can manifest such gross level of incompetence and stay employed. Where can you do that? Where can you say you're the experts and then you want to holler you're not ready? Then when someone starts something else over here because you weren't ready, you get mad when they started. See, we got all these powerful ways we shut work down. All these the nonprofit mafia says, hey, we're the experts. We're the experts. Then when it's time to go do some really big work, you say, oh, but we're not ready. But hell, you've been around for 20, 30 years. You haven't built deep benches. You haven't been diverse. Now you want me to excuse you while you get ready. It's ridiculous. I have no sympathy for it. I can't even have an answer for it because it's so dumb. Because here's what I know. You fire people of color every day who are not ready. Give them no space to get ready. Give them no support. That's why I said I got to work at a place that loves me, because I watch too many people of color get bounced because they've never had the privilege of learning how to work around wealthy people, to know how to frame things in the way that the dominant culture wants it done. Not because they don't know how to do it, but they never had that coach to guide them. And people are so intolerant of their not being ready. You see my point? So intolerant of it. I just don't have the skill that we need. And they frame it in all these exotic ways. You know, I wish we could just find more talented people around here. Can you help me figure that out? No, they're there. You just don't have the skill because they sure as hell can't model it by looking at your ass. Does that make sense? So, folks, the reality is this. Readiness, why do you hear me saying my job is to keep getting better? I acknowledge my own bad practice. I modeled my learning, which was to say, let me slow down, get a system in my head that I'm trying to lead people to instead of running around coaching them and getting frustrated because they can't perform. I'm modeling what needs to happen. That's why I said I only talk about what I'm doing. It's not good enough for me to just show up with a college degree and say, I'm Dr. Mcafee. I got to get better, day in and day out. And Jeff Canada said something I so appreciated when I first took my job. I was in New York, went to see Jeff. I thought we were going to commiserate. I'm excited to be helping bring his baby to the federal level. Jeff calls me in his room and says, hey, brother, what's going on? I'm like, I'm doing well, Jeff. Big-eyed and stuff. He says, let me tell you one thing. Hey, man, if you can't do this job, I'll find somebody who will. I was like, that's what I'm talking about. Because what he was saying is, I want to get something done. Now, if you can't do it, no problem. We'll still be cool, but we won't be cool when you have this job. Somebody else will have the job, and we can still be cool. And so I'm always clear about separating out what's work and what's us being cool. And in too many of our communities, readiness is a smokescreen for folks not willing to do it, and for folks who have sat on their butts for too long and don't have the skill, the mastery to do it. And the only problem now is no one will fire them. Now, I don't know what you do with that. But it doesn't mean, this was a readiness journey. This was a readiness journey. Folks, we're doing adaptive work. So here, this is the nuance. This is the nuance, and this is why I appreciate your question. The nuance is the work that we're doing, we don't know how to do. That's the adaptive challenge. So I'm not saying you have to know how to do everything, but you sure as hell got a lot modeled, knowing how to learn rapidly, fail quickly in fixing it, having the willingness to actually do the work that is unknown. Right? And so that's what I mean. This is adaptive work. By its mere definition, we don't know how to do it. So no fault there. Where you hear me making the critique is for folks who want to hold on to their sectors of the market and their neighborhoods, et cetera, never really get out of their comfort zone or have to change anything that they're doing, and are able to get away with simply saying, well, you know, readiness is 5 years. When those same people, when it's their kids, and they walk to a summer camp or whatever, and something's not right that same day, they'd be like, you know what, fix it tomorrow, I'm taking my kid out of it. I just want us to have the same urgency that we have for our own kids. See, the user experience is very different when it comes to our own kids. There's nowhere when my daughter was little, you were going to put her and tell me, well, you know, Mr. McAfee, we're on this 5-year change process, see? So that means the first 5 years of your child's life, she's screwed. No, it was unacceptable. So all I'm saying is have the same sense of urgency, the same disrespect and contempt for hearing excuse making for kids who don't have that buying option. I had a buying option. I could pay for something else. Most of us in this room have buying options. If we show up with that same urgency, we'll transform the culture. Now, the problem right now is the culture isn't skewed to what I'm talking about. So folks like me are always vulnerable because it's easy to fire us. It's easy to project into us. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's on this fanciful thing, and he's just out there, and he doesn't get it, and he doesn't understand. I wish he'd be more patient. Sounds great. People will buy the excuse. They'll buy you projecting into me, when the reality is the system was already mediocre. The system was already not performing. And so this is why I started with saying we have to reimagine a new ecosystem. That's why I like you're talking about design. Folks, we got to design new stuff. And everybody who's been a player won't be. And the question is, do you want to deal with that? So in many cases, this work is about a lot of stuff that you would think is not the work, but it becomes the work. Everybody who's a nonprofit executive director does not deserve to continue to keep getting grants simply because they've been in existence for 20 or 30 years. They don't. And the problem in this sector, when you say that, most people run out of the room. I won't get out of the room because I'll fight back with you. You know, so you're not going to run me away because you get mad and you want to huff and puff. That doesn't scare me. But a lot of people, they get scared and intimidated by people huffing and puffing. And so readiness, you need to be clear about what are you getting ready to do. Readiness should be, we're going to get ready to learn how to organize ourselves this way. It sure as hell should not be around, we're going to have to learn how to do third grade reading when we know there's plenty of good folks in the community who know how to do that. You see the difference? That technical expertise can be bought. So I'm not going to try to build your capacity, your organization to do that and lose kids for 5 years when I can go buy that technical competence. And so that's got to be the difference. When there's a technical competence that you can buy, and if folks want to learn on the sidelines as we use that technical competence, then great. But I'm not going to lose kids while I'm trying to build capacities that folks have told me that they have. And here's the last thing I'll say about this. If you want to see the lies that we've told, pull any proposal that you want, and you'll see all these grand statements of readiness. So why is it when it's time to do work, all of a sudden now people are telling me about readiness? The Promised Neighborhoods proposals were that way. It was just good grant writers. And when you looked at it, people said, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And as soon as they got their money, they were sitting around bumping into each other just like atoms bouncing around. And I was like, man, you mean we're going to lose this federal program because you've now got a legally binding document that's public to everybody where you said you were going to do all this fancy stuff. And that's why we had to accelerate this stuff. 2 years in, the GAO came out to audit Promised Neighborhoods. Senator Klein issued an audit because he was trying to kill Promised Neighborhoods. Now, having been around long enough, I should have known in this political environment that you're going to get hit. So for me to not anticipate that and have participated in the malpractice of letting Promised Neighborhoods get destroyed because I chose to run around the country talking and writing papers, et cetera, and not developing a system that could defend itself against an attack would have been my own incompetence. You see my point? Senator Klein went out, interviewed 40 folks. If you pull up GAO and Promised Neighborhoods, you'll see the report. He didn't even issue the report publicly because what he saw is the discipline that I'm talking about. Now, most of you know it takes us 2 years to just start talking to each other. And what he saw in 2 years was the emergence of this stuff. We issued the report because the GAO started highlighting these things. Now, what's fascinating is they only look for waste, fraud, and abuse. They don't care about the good stuff you're doing. They looked for waste, fraud, and abuse, and they still were describing these things. And so that's why I'm telling you that. Now, to get to this point was a fight. The Department of Education called me and said, what are you doing buying the data infrastructure for the Promised Neighborhoods Network? We can't have a point of view about data. I said, but you wrote in your document that folks should be using data for learning, continuous improvement, and shared accountability. That's your language in the funding notice. Now you're going to let grantees go out here and spend millions of dollars to become software developers when there's perfectly good case management systems on the market. Think about how dumb that is. We don't even know how to do cradle to career work. Now you're going to try to become a software developer. Now you're trying to do two things you don't know how to do. We bought the data system, saved our network more than $3 million a year, got people up on the system in 6 months as opposed to 3 years. And the Urban Institute created this huge data, we call it the data Bible, that actually helped people understand shared data agreements with school districts, how to do community surveys, all that stuff. So we were adding value. It meant that I needed to be on a plane every month back to DC to stay in relationship with the department. When we brought the discipline of results-based accountability, the Department of Education said, you can't do that. Wow, you mean we can't have discipline? Our legal counsel says you can't have a point of view about discipline. What do you think this work is? Again, we disagreed and we kept moving. Now, here's where my own maturity came in. I stayed in relationship. I asked the Annie E. Casey Foundation to facilitate a relationship, some conversations between me, the Harlem Children's Zone, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, the Urban Institute, and the Department of Education in the summer of 13 or 14. And that was our moment to argue and fight it out and get clear about how we were going to help each other. But we had to have some fights because we were going to lose Promised Neighborhoods. And we would have lost it, first, before we got to the sites, we would have lost it because of my incompetence. Second, we would have lost it because of Ed's incompetence. And third, we would have lost it because the sites weren't ready to do the work that they wrote in their proposals. Now think about all the kids, 14 million children living in poverty in America. We get this huge opportunity to start making a new argument, and we're blowing it. Before the Republicans even get the chance at us, before they even get a shot at us, we've blown it. Does that make sense? So this is why I don't have tolerance for this notion of readiness unless it's around the right stuff, because readiness becomes a smokescreen for us being lazy, us not staying continuously developing ourselves, and us actually not wanting to make tough choices about whether we should stay in business or not. One last question. Yes, sir.
So to kind of stay on this same topic, one of the things that I've seen sometimes is a sense of urgency that pushes people toward jumping into a program before they've done the sense-making component. Mm-hmm. So I'm really interested in hearing about how you infuse the process with the sense-making component without just sitting around talking all the time, but getting to action.
So that's the challenge. And so you all have to find your own style about how you bring all this stuff to life. But I find that if you structure the right conversations, people want to participate because people are already tired of coming to meetings that waste their time. So that's the easy thing. And if you start laying this out so you can say to folks, you know what, I know there's going to be a lot of energy around the programmatic stuff, we're going to get there. But can I get you to join me up here? Because I want to relieve some of the pain that you've been experiencing for years. I want to alleviate the pain of you not getting funded to do the work at the level you want to do it at. I want to work on all that stuff, but first I got to make sure we're on the same page. And I got to make sure we're crafting the right strategy. I haven't found people to resist that substantially. I find people complain and be like, we got to do this now and all that. I get all that. But I think if you take up your role forcefully and respectfully, people will allow you the space to do this. Because remember, when I'm facilitating this stuff, it's other folks up here doing this work. So if I'm really doing my job well, I should have the nonprofit executives and parents and others driving these conversations. I'm running in the background helping them structure it so that they're getting sense-making of it. They're learning how to do it. I'm not driving this for them out front. So I'm not going to let you, that's what I mean when I say projection. I'm not going to let them project into the facilitator like somehow I'm forcing them to do a new process. I'm going to show up with the good data. I'm going to be in service of them behind the scenes. I'm going to co-design the agenda with them. I'm going to help them do this. I'm sitting over there if they run into some challenges, but they need to come in the room and do this work. And if you structure it that way, they own it because it's theirs. And they really own it because they don't want to stand up there struggling with stuff that they don't know. It's amazing how humble people get when they don't know something. So automatically all that false bravado and aggression goes away because people want help because they're going to be standing up there talking to their peers who can be tough. And so I've not had a lot of pushback on finding ways to get people into the system because people are already frustrated with not being able to get the things done that they want to get done. Where the big challenge comes in is when we start moving down to the systems and policy work and figuring out how do you create that advocacy infrastructure that will be there when you leave, that will put pressure on folks to continue to do the work. But this is where you've got to figure out what your style is. I want to be, and I always say this to folks so they know, don't bring me in if you don't want this. I'm going to be respectful, but I'm going to be disruptive. And if you want to get something done, you should call me. But if you don't, you will not like me, so I would prefer you just not even bring me in. Again, remember I said I got to know my lane, right? Some folks just want to bring in a facilitator who will be neutral. Folks, I don't believe in neutral facilitation. This work ain't neutral. I need to drive you to results, and I need to know how to be neutral enough to let you noodle and struggle and process and figure out the answers yourself. But at some point, if I got to put a foot in your butt to get you going, I got to do that. This work isn't neutral. So all that Pollyannish stuff about just watching people struggle and flounder is bull, I think, because equity isn't neutral. Does that make sense? And so you need to think about your own facilitative style. As you hear me saying, I thought about mine, because I'm not going to be neutral and just let you flounder for 5 hours. I'm going to push you to getting some results in the meeting. They're going to be articulated in the agenda. And I can show you really good examples of co-designed agendas where you'll see that. And so this is the work, folks. If we can bring greater skill, the greater technical skill to our work, we can then stay focused on the adaptive stuff that's happening in the room that can get in the way. And if we do this, I'm telling you, to watch the Promised Neighborhood sites, and now be working with folks like Pittsburgh around economic development that has nothing to do with this, and using this same approach, but watching them own it, it's quite powerful. So as I close, think about how you're going to show up that can accelerate folks getting stuff done faster than they would have done without you being there. How are you going to think about scaling this work? When I talk about scale, I'm talking about serving at least 60% of the people that need it. And then how will you sustain this work? By reimagining uses for existing resources, reimagining how an ecosystem needs to be designed so that it earns the right to be capitalized in this new way. And then what is the leadership voice that you bring that will attract people to hold with you enough and be on a journey with you long enough so that you can do this work? Thank you.
Sure, I speak for everyone in saying thank you so much for doing your job. Exactly what we asked you to do: disrupt us, challenge us, and inspire us. We couldn't have had a better speaker. You've given us food for thought for years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
No problem.
Okay, so we are at lunch. I'm not sure, is this on? Yeah, okay. We have a few different lunch locations. The main group will be traveling just back across the street. We're just getting you exposed just a little bit of heat. Just across the street to the Gutman Library reading area. It's just when you walk in the door and you take a right, it's that big open space. You won't miss it. You'll smell the food. For the